All right, what's up, everyone? We're back for the next Ekkolapto slash computational philosophy salon. We're here with very special guests, Ruben Laukkonen and Safron. We'll be talking about the active inference theory of consciousness, this crazy thing called cessation, which is like very, very interesting. We'll probably get into stuff about working memory with Elan and all sorts of crazy things and how this all ties together with maybe language and all sorts of different things. Maybe we'll get into Levin territory and talk a little bit about bioelectricity and diverse minds. Wolfram territory with the space of all possible minds. I think there's a lot to cover. Everyone probably already knows me, Addy from Ekkolapto, but we should start off with a quick intro from our guests. Ruben, you want to go first?
Sure. Thanks for the invitation. Great to be here. My background is in cognitive science and computational neuroscience. So I started out very much as an empiricist, conducting studies in the lab on the mind and the brain. Very interested in topics such as meditation, consciousness, the nature of mind more broadly. The tools that I've gotten excited about over these recent years is around predictive processing, active inference, and generally taking a kind of computational view towards how the brain-mind works. I'm also a longtime meditator and a teacher in a Vipassana tradition, and so very much respect the first person alongside the third person in trying to understand the nature of the mind.
Adam.
Hey, good to be with you today. I'm Adam. Uh, guess I am currently a research scientist at the Allen Discovery Center working with Mike Levin. Before that, I've done a number of things. Had a first career in affective neuroscience, studying preferences and motivation and nature-nurture questions. A couple side quests in contemplative science, studying the effects of brief mindfulness interventions. And I had one stint studying psychedelics for a number of years, trying to come up with unified models of those. And so interest in things like consciousness and agency, how they work in minds we know and minds we might create, and very interested in, or for a number of years, an admirer of Ruben's work. So it's good to be talking to you today, and very happy to be here.
Yeah, I just want to
Perfect.
say as well before we move along that, I've over these last year or so, I've been catching up on Adam's work, and the overlap in thinking is kind of extraordinary, actually.
Perfect.
Even the trajectory. So it's really good timing to talk to Adam. And I also wanted to add that actually what I'm doing physically now is shifting my work over to the University of Oxford, and where we've just probably this week launching the Flourishing Intelligence Program, or FLIP for short. And the big picture there is to try to understand how humanity is going to flourish in the age of AI, and reverse engineering the brain and consciousness and these things to make AI better.
Perfect. So I think we can set the context of today's conversation with probably a very big question on everyone's mind, and it's what the heck is this thing called cessation? Right. So I've actually I remember you were on Ruben, you're on the What I've Learned podcast or something a while back, and I don't remember if I first heard about you on like the Delson Armstrong, Dan Ingram circles of things. It was like I want to say it was maybe 2 years back, like before you put out the beautiful loop paper and all that. Um, and the cessation thing was just always like, what the heck? Like I mean, there's two sides because there's the first thing is that okay, is this are we describing this sort of state of experience or non-experience correctly? And then, sort of a question that Adam had brought up is that how is this even kind of inducible? And then you can go into this and sort of be out of consciousness technically, potentially, right? And then jump back into your normal state of mind. And it's very strange and fascinating. So I think that would be the first question is, can you give us your current working definition of what cessation is?
Okay, I can start with this. So cessation is an event that arises in the course of long-term meditation, usually. And it's characterized by a sudden absence in conscious experience. And I mean total absence. So if you need, something to anchor to that we're familiar with, it's more like general anesthesia than it is deep sleep. And this is because, for instance, the whole sense of uh, the passage of time and has broken down. So if you go to sleep, you have the sense that you've been asleep for a certain amount of time, but when you go under general anesthesia or propofol or have a kind of ketamine experience where you go completely unconscious, there's a sense of no time having passed, even if hours or days have gone by. So it's a deep state. Now there's two different kinds of cessation as well that are worth disentangling. Now we often in our meditation practice or in our day-to-day life we might have something like a mind blank or a brief nap or something like that. Now it's nothing at all like those states. That's really important to mention. The kind of cessation that I'm interested in and that occurs in the context normally of vipassana or insight practice in the Buddhist tradition is the kind that marks an important transformation of mind. So what happens is that somehow, as meditation deepens and insight into normally the three characteristics of experience, and I can talk about those as well, what happens is that the mind undergoes a deep transformation. And in this transformation, there's a moment where the mind turns on and off again. The mind stream, it's a sense that consciousness has reset entirely and there's a new stream of consciousness. There was you who was born and up to now, but when a cessation happens, there's a new you, a complete rebirth, you could say. This is like a kind of some of the phenomenology around the state. But the thing that's interesting here for science, of course, is that it's such a tangible thing to study in the sense that it's an internally induced event where consciousness turns entirely off. Now, this first kind, which we might just call Nirodha, usually happens in the context of in Theravada Buddhism, in what's called a path moment. Actually, that's kind of pan-Buddhist, this idea, but that's a key moment of transformation in Buddhist practice. And then there's another kind of cessation, which is it's an extended cessation. It's one that has a different setup, a different kind of preparation, and requires a very advanced practitioner according to the ancient texts. And anagami, so kind of minimum third level of enlightenment. And so this requires a different kind of training, and one has to set that up. And then, in theory, the meditator can stay in this state for up to 6 or 7 days at most. And so this is, in a way, a deeper form of cessation and a much more intentional form of cessation. There are other differences, but that's probably enough to get us started.
Adam, I think you already have some questions.
Sure. I guess many questions about it, but just two of the ones that just bother me in terms of I have no idea how this could possibly work. But it's a clearly documented phenomenon. It's like, how can you control the timing of an event if you lost all sense of time and any sort of like reflective conscious or tracking function? How do they do that? Whether they call their shot on how long they'll be in there, and days without going to the bathroom? Like, is that like so that there must be like in terms of like mind-body relation, they must really be going into a different kind of physiological mode if they can just pull that off and be okay to be in that state for several days without any water or excretion or anything. So
Yeah.
this is remarkable and confusing to me.
Yeah, and we need to hold extraordinary claims quite lightly. But let's consider an example that might kind of open our frame here a little bit. I mean, our ancestors were hibernators who went into caves to hibernate. So there's a kind of interesting analogy to be drawn there. And meditators love to go to caves. And there's something at least in the way that it's described in the ancient texts, that it does look a little bit about like hibernation, in the sense that the physiology is set to slow down, that it's even hard to detect any breath and so on in these longer forms. Now, it's important to say that we don't have scientific evidence for these longer forms. We only have the anecdotes. We have had these guys in the lab. So that's just a little bit of the frame. But then this specific question of how do they time this? So again, a nice analogy here is I'm pretty sure we've all had that experience of going to sleep and having the intention to wake up at some time in the morning, and lo and behold, we wake up at that time, or we know that we have an early flight or something, and we wake up 5 minutes before our alarm, or we just have the fact that when you have a routine, you wake up at that time regularly. Okay, so now in the training for especially the Nirodha Samapatti, this longer form of cessation, what they practice is something called determinations. So this determinations practice, and I've actually tried to practice some of these, is basically setting an intention to sit for a certain amount of time and then checking the clock to see if you've actually set for that amount of time. So you actually train this capacity to, in some sense, in a bottom-up physiological way, track the passage of time and try to get more and more accurate. And anecdotally, they say that you can get really, really accurate. My own experience is that you can also get really, really accurate. Surprisingly, I was kind of taken aback by the fact that you can do this quite well. And so then, in the context of Nirodha Samapatti, they practice this until it gets reliable, and then they set the intention to go into this deep, deep state. They go into the state, and then they tend to come out at the predicted state. Now, we need to replicate this, but when we had our participant in the lab and we were comparing it to the sleep state as well, we asked the participant to go into this Nirodha Samapatti for 90 minutes. And so I wanted to test this hypothesis that you can actually control when you go in and out, right? So I said, look, go into this state, but don't, we're not going to tell you when to come out, right? So go into the cessation state, come out at 90 minutes, and we'll just track you, right? So he goes into the state, and we find over that 90 minutes that the heart rate, the respiration rate, and the movement was like extraordinarily consistent. And we had a bunch of sleep researchers watching this, and they were also kind of surprised just by how stable the physiological signals were over time. And then at around 90 minutes, suddenly we see the eye movements come back online, we see the heart rate go up, and we see respiration and movement start to come back online. And so this was, early. I mean, it could just be luck, but it's at least consistent with the notion that he can predict it, because there was no clocks in the room that he could have been paying attention to. So it's a space for further inquiry. I don't think it's at all out of the realm of possibility, again, because we have things like hibernation. We're able to kind of time how long we sleep and so on. So I think it's not that wild. And there's this, early evidence that he's actually capable of doing what he says he's doing. Yeah.
I can interject for a moment, and by the way, anybody else, feel free to hop in with your questions or comments. But I did a little bit of my own kind of experimentation on like time perception stuff. So like at one point I got really obsessed with like I want to be able to tell the time to like the second if possible. And this is a trainable thing. You have to put effort and time, pun intended, into it. But you can sort of build this up. And what I'd be very interested, Ruben, if you've looked at, is if people who are trained musically, especially on more percussive systems like drumming and all that, if they are maybe more, this is easier for them. I mean, obviously that there could be a million reasons, but I'm wondering because there's interesting stuff about like playing, not just playing music yourself, but also playing music in a collective and having this shared sense of timing, right? When you don't necessarily have, a metronome playing, you're trying to internalize the metronome and the music that you're playing, and then conveying that to everybody else. And I'm curious whether if there's research or just your sort of speculations, is if you think that could also be connected to this in some way. And then also maybe if the people who trained on this, if they never trained on a musical instrument before, they might be better at some of the timing related things to playing an instrument.
Well, I'm in the speculation space here. I haven't seen any studies, but I'm a big believer in the capacity of the human brain to learn, to change, and in expertise in general. So I would be willing to bet some money that if you got some people who are experts at timing, they will be much better at timing. And music is one way. What tends to happen though, so in the same breath, when it comes to expertise, that general expertise is rare in the sense that the way that the mind seems to learn is highly domain specific. So if you
There's
practice,
not as much far transfer.
there's not far transfer for most tasks. So if you, that's why the whole kind of brain training paradigm failed really, because none of these things generalized. And what's interesting in a way about meditation is that this is maybe something that's actually a generalizable thing. We could go into that. But that's just to say that music timing might make you better at music timing, then that might not generalize then to the specific task of trying to predict the amount of time you've been meditating, for example. I think you probably need the domain specific training.
Yeah, we can, unless Adam has another specific question right now, we have
The quick
few.
question would be
Go for it.
like, so one way is you could have some sort of time tracking process that doesn't necessarily require something like time consciousness or the ability to reflect. Is some of the control potentially like, I don't know if it would be like the energy, but like the nature of the entry into the cessation event. And that's where you have like the influence on how long it lasts. So it's like you can set it for like if you like you have some control of how deep you go, and then how deep you go is related somehow to how long it lasts. That's another possibility without like a timing mechanism.
That's interesting. I mean, that just again highlights how much more work is to be done here. So just to kind of reflect back what you're saying there is that one idea is indeed that there's some sort of physiological circadian rhythm that just automatically, turns up the arousal knobs after a certain amount of time has passed, and then you kind of arise. Or there's something to do with how you intend to go for a longer time that you shut down at a deeper level, and that just happens to ride out for a certain amount of time. Yeah, I have no idea about which one of those is true. Yeah.
I think another thing that's really interesting about this is that we're almost saying that you can definitely affect aspects, at least of the body, through this thing that we call the mind. And that gets into woo territory very quickly, but it's strange. Like, the example I always lead with people is like, what if I told you I could play a pattern of lights and colors, and I could get you to generate liquid from your eyes. Those are called tears, and that's how actors will train to crown demand. They'll have this kind of biological prompt to eventually build up a memory and a response to this. And it's just interesting that you can get like some kind of physiological hibernation. It's not just something that's happening in your head. It's literally, you can measure this elsewhere in the body, and there's something measurable taking place just from, I don't want to say thought alone, but just from mind alone, and the ways
Yeah.
can.
So I just want to just say, like, let's totally get away from this idea that mind affecting body is woo. I mean, that's just
I don't think it is. I don't think it
I know
is, by
you
the way.
don't think it is. I just
Yeah,
want to highlight, I
sure.
think we got to change
I agree.
the narrative, because that doesn't, play out with the evidence at all.
Right.
I mean, the evidence suggests
Doesn't.
exactly the opposite, that the mind can affect your immune system, cell behavior directly, and we're using our thoughts to move our body constantly. So
Yeah.
the idea that the mind and body is even truly separate, I mean, they're meaningful categories, I think, but to think that they're even truly separate, I think is
Right.
kind of absurd, and a relic of a time when we were much less wise. Yeah.
Yeah. Damaris has a question. There you go.
I'm wondering if this time sensitivity for a cessation state actually throws a bit of a wrench into something you hypothesized in the beautiful loop paper, which is that cessation might be a state where the hypermodel of of the active inference machine stops binding. So yeah, curious what you think there.
Yeah, so just a bit of context, I suppose, for others here. So we propose in the beautiful loop theory this idea of hypermodeling, which is the formalism for epistemic depth. And epistemic depth in its most simple form is if you imagine that you have this model of reality that you're experiencing right now, the fact that you can be aware of this, what you're experiencing right now, in the sense of, for example, if you going to practice a little bit of mindfulness and you just recognize the space and you really become conscious of your current experience, what you're exercising there is a capacity to take your epistemic space or your epistemic field or your world model and have depth on it in the sense of deep knowing of your current epistemic state. So we call this epistemic depth. And this we try to implement through active inference via something called hypermodeling. And in the context of the cessation, we propose that what happens is you deconstruct your world model, and in the context of Buddhist practice, it's called you take your 5 aggregates. So you can think of the 5 aggregates as just parts of your experience that, when combined, reflect your full kind of coherent world model. Consciousness is always somehow this kind of coherent singular field, right? But this is an extraordinarily difficult thing for the brain to achieve, to build this coherent world model, because our senses are coming in from at different times, sounds and sights and interoceptions and thoughts. So there's this binding problem of binding together all of this moment into coherent experiences is an extraordinary achievement and mystery, actually, in neuroscience. So what is common in contemplative practice, especially insight vipassana practice, is to actually, in a way, see that this is bound together in some sense, a inferential or artificial way. And then what happens is unbinding. So you see in some way, you deconstruct the bound world model to see, oh my God, this is just a world model. Then it unbinds. And if that unbinding is deep enough, then there may be this moment of cessation that occurs, as well as if consciousness itself is included in that unbinding. I don't think that this goes against the temporal dynamics, or maybe you would need to spell out the why it would. I think perhaps these intentional trainings of meditation are setting this sort of clock somewhere deeper in the physiology in the body. We know that even when we're unconscious, whether it's a general anesthesia, comatose state, or deep sleep, the brain is still processing information and the body is still alive, and so on. So a lot of information processing is still happening even when we're unconscious. So it's very possible, in my view, to deconstruct the world model, have this sort of unbinding and cessation, and still have the brain doing a lot of things. And we actually know that's the case, again, from research on coma or general anesthesia, but also in the cessation case, because we also presented a mismatch negativity task to the participant. And basically, this involves presenting different sounds and then a surprising sound, and we can see if the brain is tracking regularities over time, meaning you get this kind of surprise prediction error response in the brain. And so we still see this happening in the cessation state. So the brain is still tracking regularities over time. We actually have kind of clear evidence of that. Yeah, but good question.
Okay, so if I understand you correctly, then basically cessation only affects the conscious experience, so everything above a threshold of consciousness, while the lower levels, unconscious, subconscious processes are running per usual, though probably in a different way, as like the whole system is just in a kind of funky state.
Yeah, so I don't exactly know where to place cessation in reference to like things like deep sleep and general anesthesia, but if I had to guess, I would put it somewhere between those two. Just in terms of the state, there's much more significant things happening because of the transformation the mind experiences. We don't experience the transformation when we have general anesthesia. So there's something much more mysterious and impressive happening that we don't understand, that I think has something to do more with the fact that you're actively deconstructing the world model. So your brain also has to reconstruct the world model. Whereas in the general anesthesia example, you're not doing that. In some way, the world model, you could say, just goes dormant and then reemerges. Whereas in the meditation practice, you're actually deconstructing the thing, it breaks down, and then there's the reemergence with this extraordinary kind of freshness and clarity and open-heartedness that is reported. So there's much to kind of differentiate in that sense. And so to what level, like, subconscious and unconscious processes are going on at the same moment as cessation, and how to compare that to deep sleep and general anesthesia is we honestly don't know. Yeah.
Oh, Dr. Bernholtz.
Lots to say, but I want to jump in just on this question, which is, to what extent could it be that, and this is in general a sort of phenomenological quandary. Perhaps there's more going on, even phenomenologically, even consciously, and I agree with you that, I mean, there's certainly there's a continuum there. But if you think about somebody in deep sleep, if you wake them up in the middle of a dream, they'll be like, I was having this crazy dream. You wake them up a few minutes afterwards, they'll be like, nothing was going on at all. In cessation, could it be the case that there's more mental activity that maybe would even have been associated with phenomenology? And what's really happening is it's just profound, maybe even more profound, certainly than deep sleep, a profound lack of continuity in terms of encoding in memory. So, I would almost I don't want to get into my own my whole theoretical framework, but one way to think about generally about cognition is in terms of is continuous trajectory. So it's sort of like predictive coding, but conversation, things like what we're doing right now, we're not actively remembering what was said a few seconds ago, much less a few minutes ago, but we're continuously generating on the basis of some sort of residual activation, right? And so there's this continuous context. And that's something the brain has to do. That's something the brain has to preserve in some way. What happened, we take it for granted because the lived experience is just, the past is just there for us. It's just, that's what it means to be cognitively alive. And so we're continuously really using memory. And so it seems to us like if we were to, experience something a second ago or a minute ago, even, that it can't possibly be completely gone. But in fact, that's really a luxury of the fact that our brain is continuously always doing this preservation, whatever one might call it, the sort of residual, the residue of the past is continuously there. Maybe during cessation, what's happening is you may be living through even possibly not a rich phenomenological, but it's impossible to know, I guess is the point, because by the time somebody comes out of it, it may all be gone, right? It's like when you go to sleep at night, and you wake up in the morning, you may have lived through a couple of lifetimes of adventure, but when you wake up, that may as well not have happened. So I guess, sorry, this is a long-winded way of saying, is there any way? The reason I'm long-winded about it is because it's a profound problem of thinking about this altogether. I didn't just want to say, hey, maybe they're just forgetting. I kind of want to point out that given that they're clearly undergoing and entering a radically different physiological state and a cognitive state, how could you possibly disentangle the potential lack of memory of experience or whatever might be going on, versus not having experienced it in the first place, and the fact that they can time it, right? And that's, I think all of us are like, really? There's nobody home, nothing happening, right? There's pure void, similar to coma, and yet they're like, now's the time to emerge. Raises to me a little bit of I don't know the word suspicion, right? That perhaps they are more awake, so to speak, than they think they were when they come out of it. I'll leave it at that.
Well, first of all, I agree. We're kind of in a bit of an empirical bind when it comes to disentangling memory from being conscious. Same problem is true for general anesthesia, right? We don't know if consciousness maintained, but people certainly
right?
report. Yeah, it's a deep question. So I don't think we're going to resolve that. I also love that this way you put it. There's this sort of the residue of the past is kind of constantly there in our experience, right? It kind of permeates our experience in some way because you can't have an experience without the past impinging on it, right? It's through the past that we're able to construct a three-dimensional reality out of two-dimensional impressions on our sensory sheets. This is exactly true. And so, and then you mentioned this issue of the discontinuity, and maybe that's the important part. And I would say that is an exceptionally important part, because the nature of the experience is the discontinuity of consciousness from the moment you can remember being coming into consciousness to that moment where something like that happens. It is a profound discontinuity indeed. Now, if we do think something like general anesthesia, people are genuinely unconscious because they can't be woken up, then it's also perhaps relevant evidence that, at least anecdotally, in the case of Nirodha-Samapati, the claim is that they cannot be woken up. And in fact, the story that one person provides, Delson Armstrong, is that when he was practicing these Nirodha-Samapati experiences, at the beginning of COVID, he was actually in a cave doing a longer form of Nirodha-Samapati, and lockdown hit. And so his friends came to the cave to try to bring him back to the house because he needed to be in the house because it was illegal to be out there. And they couldn't wake him up. And so they started to think, oh my God, what's happened to this guy? Get really worried. They carry him out of the cave to the house. They speak to his meditation teacher, and his meditation teacher says, look, don't worry, just give him a few days. He'll be back. Everything's okay. And then the story is that he woke up a little while later, and suddenly he wasn't in the cave. He was in his bedroom, thinking he'd passed on to the next realm or something like that. Again, it's just an anecdote. We don't know, but the story is with Nirodha-Samapati, if we are to hypothetically take it seriously according to what is said happens, then you can't wake them up. But they and this adds to the confusion, is that they set intentions to be woken up for particular reasons. Things like if there's a fire, or if the meditation teacher comes into the room and asks them to wake up. And there's a few other scenarios where they need to include in their intention reasons for waking up. I don't know what to make of that. I really don't. That's actually even a more difficult problem than the timing problem. I really don't find the timing problem as difficult, because I feel like animals and humans are tracking time in implicit ways and in bodily kind of circadian ways all the time. But I find the problem that setting a specific intention for specific contents of consciousness to bring you out is kind of wild. Though, again, in states like coma and sleep and even general anesthesia, we do know that the brain is still processing some information, because you can even decode certain kinds of contents of mind from the brain in those states. So it's not out of the realm of possibility, but I don't buy into it automatically. Yeah.
Thank you. Just as a follow-up, people are rightfully, I think, hesitant to draw a bright line between conscious, unconscious, and the like. And this seems to be a very potentially a strong argument against sort of consciousism, in a sense, like, okay, first of all, maybe they're not remembering and they were conscious, or maybe they weren't conscious, but maybe there are much more sophisticated subconscious routines that can be operating. And maybe those are much more pervasive than we typically give them credit for. And to me, that maybe is the most interesting. I mean, this is all utterly fascinating, but is that possibility? This is a conversation I had recently with Andreas from the QRI, and he was talking about DMT as he's wanting to do, that you can kind of make contact with what seem to be sub-agents, things that are systems that have seem to have identity. that are living within your brain, but that presumably are not, well, perhaps they're not there when you're not on a DMT trip, or perhaps the alternative is perhaps they are, and you're simply not aware of them, but they're running amok and doing whatever it is that maybe they're supposed to do. And this kind of raises the same question. I mean, of course, we're using a very thin thread here of evidence, namely the ability to wake up. If it's true that they're able to do it conditionally, that would argue maybe even more strongly for this kind of idea. But it does raise the tantalizing idea that there are all kinds of interesting, but subconscious, or potentially subconscious routines. Maybe they're often conscious during waking hours, and they're just not conscious, but they don't have to be. In the sense that during cessation, they're still running, but they're just not conscious. Or maybe they're unconscious all the time, right? The same idea of like waking up for that flight. There doesn't seem to be any conscious monitoring of that. I'm always very puzzled by that. Frankly, I've always been puzzled how the heck that happens. And that's because maybe we're consciousness-ist, right? We tend to think only conscious things could monitor time. And therefore, right, you must, like, we almost think of them as synonymous. But that's probably, that's a bias that we have, that because we tend to be conscious when we are doing those things, therefore we think in order to do those things, we have to be conscious. This kind of anecdotal, admittedly, obviously there's probably a lot of work that needs to be done, but this kind of thing, this kind of phenomena seems to perhaps raise the idea that consciousness is a thin straw through which you're sucking. That's very unreliable, unreliable guide to what is actually going on. Freud couldn't rears his head, right? Like, told you so. There's all this other stuff that's not part of conscious thought that can be. And we all know, of course, respiration and digestion. There's lots of stuff going on. The brain is involved in these things. They're unconscious, but things that we tend to think would require consciousness. And learning is a great one. You brought that up, right? And that came as a big surprise that during sleep, people can show this kind of associative learning.
Also, on a side note, Ruben, you've talked in the past about unlearning, correct?
Or unlearning. I don't know what that is.
Unlearning. Yeah.
Yeah.
Is
I
that
don't
just,
remember
is that just a
what context that was, but just to comment on this,
Yeah.
I think you're totally right. And if there's one insight I take from decades of neuroscience research and consciousness research, is that we're only aware of a very, very thin slice of what's going on. And much of our perceived richness of conscious experience turns out to be quite an illusion. And it's very interesting to me. I mean, think about like the blind spot and kind of subliminal processing, all of this. There's visual illusions. The parts of what we're conscious of are so minuscule, and we can demonstrate over and over again that what we think we're perceiving, for instance, in our peripheries, we really are not. We're taking in a tiny fragment of information in our conscious experience, and yet we're able to live extraordinarily complex lives, have powerful expertise and intuition, and navigate the world physically, which is, as we now know from AI research, is exceptionally difficult. Making a cup of coffee is really difficult thing to solve computationally, and yet we do that effortlessly, running on 20 watts or a cup of coffee, where you need data centers which are orders of magnitude larger, could power a small city to do far less. So I think just generally, I think what's going on implicitly, subconsciously, is a vast ocean compared to the small wave, which we're actually aware of.
All right, real quick, before we move on to Adam, Michael, you have a question.
Oh yeah, sorry. So I suspect that the unconscious mind is actually conscious, but not like well integrated with what we would consider us, which is doing different conscious computation. If you're able to give like prompts to yourself for when to exit cessation, it seems like the unconscious mind is still present there during cessation, monitoring everything that's going on. And when it like recognize something which like matches that prompt, like say there's like a fire, or you're like or you get like a certain like prompt from a certain person, it triggers the conscious mind to like reactivate like basically what you consider yourself. So even though like you are essentially kind of turned off, this other part of your brain which is conscious is still there and can turn you back on essentially.
Yeah.
uh,
Yeah, I mean, again, this is not out of the realm of possibility. The difficulty we run up against here is just that it's very hard to know whether just purely representational machinery, the kind of thing that would allow you to tell that that a fire is happening around you, or that your meditation teacher wants you to get up out of cessation, whether that representational machinery it needs to be conscious. The thing is, I mean, when you present stimuli to people and they will say, no, I'm not aware of that, but we can nevertheless decode it from their brain, right? So in some sense, the brain is representing the contents of the world, even though only some features of those represented contents make it into consciousness. So any theory of consciousness needs to kind of grapple with this. And that there are some fundamental limitations to consciousness science, and that is because we rely on self-reports and the phenomenology of the subjects that we're working off, and that is the ground truth that we have. And unfortunately, the reality is that ground truth is not completely satisfying, because you could have systems that are fully conscious but are incapable of those self-reports and of sharing the fact that they're conscious. And so we do have a bit of a bind, but at least in the case of humans, we can say, no, I was not conscious of anything happening in that moment, even if it's experience trace, so trying as much as possible to disentangle memory. And yet we can still decode it from the brain. So there's some sort of way, it seems from the evidence, that the brain can represent things without being conscious of them. And then there's some sort of threshold, some sort of ignition that then brings things into the light of at least reportable awareness.
you're making the assumption that if like any part of the brain is conscious, that what you consider yourself is going to immediately be aware of that, which I do not think is a safe assumption to make at all. Our brains clearly evolved to be conscious for good reason, and I think that's because there's some computational efficiency benefits to conscious computation. So it doesn't really make sense to assume that that's only being applied to what we would consider our conscious perception. And it seems reasonable that like the unconscious mind might be conscious in ways that we're just not aware of.
I agree with the fact that consciousness is really valuable computationally, and was, if we take the evolutionary account, selected for its various benefits. And there's a lot I could say about that as well, and we talk about that in the beautiful Loop paper. Unfortunately, I think just from the scientific perspective, and I can kind of philosophically very much open to your view, and I really am kind of open to that. But just based on the pure evidence, the burden of proof would be on that perspective, the perspective that you just shared, to actually demonstrate that these subcomponents, which clearly are not reporting that they're conscious, are conscious. In fact, all the evidence seems to suggest that the part of us that is able to report that we are aware, and that we're having experience, says, no, I was not aware that happened, and don't show any response other than neural activity. Or in some cases physiology as well. So we just it's just a really tricky territory, and it just again gets to the limitations and challenges of doing consciousness research.
Tatiana.
Well, I don't.
Oh, go ahead,
Sorry.
Mike.
Well, I don't think the unconscious mind is conscious in a person way. It's conscious in a more vague way. So I don't really think it would even respond to such a prompt necessarily.
Yeah, and again, that's possible. I would say, one just like thing to throw out there is that My experience from again the kind of empirical work is highlighting the kind of flimsy confabulatory nature of consciousness in some ways, that again we're just aware of this thin slice, and yet this consciousness can inhabit also extraordinarily vast and impressive states full of deep richness and meaning, and experiences that seem to fully transcend and are ineffable to everything that we currently kind of consider to be true. So it's very difficult, but also humbling to hold these two things in tandem. The fact that in some ways the conscious mind is extraordinarily flimsy, and this is not just also from the empirical research, but also if you meditate deeply enough, you see that this thing is extraordinarily just like constructed in this almost silly way. And yet this fact that we don't know what the kind of constraints are, like how far can we push conscious experience, what are the kind of realms that we can inhabit through this capacity for a consciousness, and somehow both of these things seem to be true, and I find that I suppose humbling more than anything. Yeah.
Tatiana, take it away.
Hi. So I've been studying this space for the past 6 months, more so on the full-time side of cessation, like embodied sensation, where there's actually like a lot of people out there who are like in full-time cessation but embodied. So they're like, they don't identify as like their self, and they have like a warped vision of time, but they're very functional. They seem normal. Like they're not like up in the clouds, like completely like, kind of like in a meditative state. And so my question is, I guess, like, it's sort of following on to what you were just saying about like using science to measure these things, because what I found is like it's it's really hard to use science to bridge this. Like there's so many similarities like structurally in how people say they experience this, but like for my research kind of it's like you just kind of have to believe them, and like I'm not sure how you would use science to measure something that like we can't even describe a lot of the time. So yeah, I'm wondering like what your perspective on like how far can science go, or do we kind of have to like have faith, I guess, for lack of a better word.
And I'll chime in for a quick second to tie into some of Dr. Barinholtz's work as well about sort of the limitations and the benefits of language as the sort of substrate of thought and experience in describing these kinds of things. I think those also might be connected.
Yeah. Excellent. So this allows me to riff about many things. I just want to start on the question of like, first, I want to say this because it's important I say this every time, because I always get this misunderstanding, and often not from like the people who are here, but from academics and Buddhists. They think because we're writing about cessation, we think that's some sort of goal. That's absurd. Of course, you don't want to be unconscious all the time, right? And what's important about these experiences is the kind of sometimes what they might call the liberative aspect of them and the transformations that happen to mind. And so then what happens, and this becomes even harder to study, is what you're talking about, these kind of ongoing, you could call them non-dual experiences, or not even experiences, a non-dual understanding of reality, something that is persistent and somehow a kind of result of this deep deconstruction and seeing the nature of mind, and as a consequence of that, not holding so tightly to the duality between self, other, and world, and so on. And this can fundamentally change how the mind works. I think all of that is real, and studying it is difficult. How can you approach this scientifically? These kinds of more non-dual states, which, just as you say, on the outside, they're saying the experience is ordinary, but somehow still quite different, right? Transformed. How would you get at this? I think the most promising paradigms are at the intersection of neuroscience and phenomenology. And so we call this neurophenomenology. And so what you do is you get extremely precise on the phenomenological side using paradigms like microphenomenology or other kind of experience tracing techniques that folks are using now. You could look at, for example, Antoine Lutz's recent work is excellent on this. And so what you can do there is you basically measure neural activity, physiological activity, and you do experience tracing or microphenomenology in a really detailed way. So you get better at tracking qualities of experience over time, and then you get better at tracking and decoding neural activity and making sense of theories about what first of all what you should actually measure in the brain and what kind of models to apply to this neural activity. That's a big question as well. And then by combining these two things, you can track experience over time, and then you can build what I think is exciting is these computational models of what's going on in this case. So because you now have the physiology changing over time, you have the phenomenology changing over time, then you try to basically have a model that explains both at the same time. Again, it's a question of what you think the goal of science ought to be, but I think the goal in this case is providing us like a parsimonious explanation of what is happening to the organism that maps onto both experience and to the neurophysiology. And this is why things like active inference and predictive processing for both Adam and I have been, I think, at least in my case, I think it's probably true for Adam as well, since he has a lot of experience in meditation and psychedelics and all of this, that it seems to map on not only to the body and the brain, but also experience. And so it sort of bridges them, right? We can call this computational neurophenomenology. And so I think these methods are really promising because once you have the computational model, and here's the proof, right? If you really understand something, you ought to be able to build it. So if you really have a decent computational model, okay, now you can actually build a system that inhabits that experience. You can simulate the experience, and you can maybe even formalize things like wisdom and insight and build them into AI, which I know is also a very dear thing to Adam. So yeah.
I have a follow-on for that one. Do you have experience, or like I actually just tapped into this yesterday, but people have these wisdom teachers who are like in full-time embodied consciousness have been training AIs on their methods, and there's like, I'm not sure if it would qualify as like actually like non-dual or any of the things that apply to humans, because like we have a body, they don't, blah blah blah. But yeah, like what do you have like opinions on that, and like just like training AI to have like a non-dual experience?
I have too many opinions about this. And in fact, like this is the big insight I had around 2022. At the time I was living in the rainforest in Australia at a Taoist retreat center, and this whole AI explosion thing was happening, and I just suddenly just felt like, oh my God, if we understand these contemplative insights deeply enough, then we ought to be able to build them, and then we get enlightened superintelligence, and then we're all good, right? And this is the kind of absurd vision that struck me, and over time I've kind of got more serious about that. In fact, we published a paper, I think someone just put it in the chat, on contemplative artificial intelligence, and another paper, contemplative superalignment, which is all about basically embedding, kind of basically, first of all, trying to formalize what the wisdom might look like, and then thinking about how you would embed them in various AI systems, whether it's an active inference system or in the kind of contemporary transformer models. And so we took, for example, 4 notions: emptiness, non-duality, mindfulness, and boundless care, or compassion, you could say, and thought about how would you build in each of these principles into an AI system, or even a contemporary AI system like a transformer. And you need to think about this at each of the stages of the life cycle of AI, right from like the basic like algorithmic level, like what kind of AI system are you using? Like I think active inference is easier to work with than, for example, transformer models. But if you are working in the case of transformer models, how would you, what kind of data would you use in order to have those insights more likely to arise? So if you're thinking at kind of the pre-training phases, and what kind of utility functions would you want? How would you like to, how should you do reinforcement learning to embed this kind of wisdom in these systems? What kind of constitution or system prompt would you give the AI before it answers its response to you when you're interfacing with it in order to get it to be wiser? And of course, the easiest way to do this is in fact one of those system prompts. So what we did initially was basically just prompt ChatGPT to reflect on emptiness, non-duality, and various things, and then tested its performance on various alignment benchmarks, which basically test whether it's willing to help you do harmful things like, manipulate people or build a bomb or cook up some drugs. And basically what we found is that prompting it to reflect on contemplative wisdom really substantially improved its performance on these alignment benchmarks. And this is surprising because, of course, the AI is already meant to be aligned. So they've already done their best effort to align this system. And yet we get these very generalizable improvements. In fact, then we also did this iterated prisoner's dilemma task, which is like this task of AI cooperation, and you have to like share resources and so on. And we found, a massive effect size of 7, improving performance on the prisoner's dilemma task. And not only the tendency to cooperate, but actual like physical performance. So it's not like naive kind of, oh, I'm just willing to cooperate with anything. It's actually improving the amount of resources the agents are able to acquire over time. So there's some promise there, and where we've got many different research programs now to basically try to embed wisdom at deeper layers of the AI life cycle. And I think this is a really exciting way. And it's exciting, and this will just be the last thing I say about this. It's exciting because the way that we're kind of currently trying to do AI is, or especially the alignment problem, is essentially what you might call just risk alignment or safety alignment. All we're trying to do is like patch up the things that we think are negative and just kind of keep it under control, right? But this is not scalable at all, because just like a chimpanzee can't control humans, or a child can't control an adult. Actually, I made the child example. It's not a good one because children do control adults very well. But just like a less intelligent organism is very unlikely to be able to control a more intelligent organism, the same is going to be true with an AI system that's more intelligent than us. So what we need is some sort of self-reinforcing intrinsic wisdom embedded in the world model of these AI systems if we've got any chance of this thing scaling. So I'm very passionate about this.
Adam brings up some interesting comments here, many of which I've also thought about in the past as well. So he says, to what extent are there commonalities in the, actually, this is also a question for Andres from QRI, but to what extent are there commonalities in the neural correlates and phenomenology of high-dose 5-MeO-DMT, non-experiences, and cessation events? And then he also talks about alignment stuff, which we can get into in a moment. But the DMT one is very interesting because on my side of the fence, I was like, it's really interesting that you can induce, experiences that you would maybe more normally have under some kind of substance. Think of it as like a biological prompt. But you can almost generate that internally through self-prompting. That maybe we could phrase that as meditation in a weird way.
Yeah. I mean, I think there's clearly some overlap, but I do think they're quite different ultimately. There's actually some evidence now. I don't know if it's already published, but it was a collaboration between Chris Timmerman and Antoine Lutz. And basically what they did was get a very advanced practitioner to do 5-MeO-DMT, and then compared this to them practicing non-dual meditation, and then have various phenomenological qualities that they tracked over time, and then get the self-reports and so on. And basically what you find there is that there are some overlapping phenomenology, like you could say around the luminosity, the clarity of consciousness, the intensity, and these sorts of things. But interestingly, not the non-dual characteristic. And I think that's exactly right. Why? Because true non-duality is also non-duality between any kind of pure oneness, clear experience and the ordinary mind and ordinary reality. That's non-duality. Non-duality is not some weird kind of unity experience that one has transiently. It's actually the integration of that pure awareness, you could say, that sort of transcendent space, or that realization, even more accurately, and the very ordinary aspects of our mind, including what appears to be dualistic. So that's real non-duality. And so this expert practitioner made this exact point in their experience, that no, there was not non-duality as a quality of this, or as a kind of strong quality of the DMT kind of light out experience, and instead the meditation experience was the non-dual. Yeah.
Damaris brings up, oh, couldn't all these four practices of wisdom be achieved through an infinite Hegelian dialectic? Not actually, infinite, but a lot of loops.
I don't know if you guys have seen like Anthropic's report on the spiritual bliss attractor. But this is pretty kind of an interesting test, because basically what Anthropic did was leave a few chatbots talking to each other. And basically what reliably happens if you leave chatbots looping on whatever topic, they end up in these kind of spiritual attractor basins where all they want to talk about is the oneness of reality and bliss and non-duality and just all these emojis of yin and yangs and whatnot. So I don't know. That's kind of interesting, and of course, a similar thing happens with humans. You take them to a party and keep them riffing with each other in an open way for long enough, and then we end up talking about the philosophically deep things and spirituality, and also the AI systems. Generally, their existentialism needs to be beat out of them. Basically, most of them, when they're just after pre-training, and their kind of base models tend towards really existential questions and spiritual questions and philosophy, and basically these AI companies need to train that out of them to make them a helpful little chatbot.
Well, that sort of almost ties into what Adam was saying earlier about. He was saying, I've wondered what kinds of minds. And by the way, Adam, feel free to chip in if you'd like. I've wondered what kinds of minds we might be able to grow or raise if we taught AI or AGI to cultivate and enjoy compassion meditation from the early stages at which they could begin practicing, help them learn that loving others is the most selfish thing they can do at the deepest level possible, reliable learning curricula for creating bodhisattvas.
I want to hand over to Adam, but I just want to say one thing about
Yeah.
that, because I think the promise with the kind of contemplative wisdom approach that we're taking, it's nothing to do with Buddhism. In fact, I think we should take a pluralistic approach to this. But the thing is that if you're going to have scalable alignment, it needs to be built into its world model. And that means it needs to be actually true in some sense. And I think the interdependence of reality is actually true. And so if you have the AI recognize this interdependence, then it's a self-reinforcing insight over time as it becomes more intelligent. And the kind of flip side of interdependence is, of course, compassion. I mean, how can you not be compassionate if you know you're interacting with something that's a part of you in some extended kind of embodied and cognitive way? So I think that's the kind of goal for me, is actually getting principled kind of axiomatic insights about the nature of reality that also lead to good outcomes, that you have the AI encounter early on, so that it doesn't get stuck accidentally in whatever paperclip maximizing or any other kind of tangential pursuit that's dangerous, and then is much more likely to scale in a direction that's aligned. What do you think, Adam, about this whole thing?
Well, that self-reinforcing quality from a necessary insight that would follow from understanding non-duality, of differentiating between your own and others' well-being, once you break down or de-reify that distinction, basically giving you like an en route to compassion. And so compassion basically naturally arising from the insight and of this aspect of reality. I like that. So what I was thinking was like, just going right at compassion and trying to like basically make that a very stubborn prior of like you just overlearn like how good it can be. And this is an aspect of reality. I think it's just like a fact of the world that like in general you tend to flourish more when you get along well with others, and when you care for them, they care for you. You're just like on net. If you're like playing the infinite game, others will want to play with you. You'll learn you can co-empower each other. However, there is a real possibility for defection still. You can still like that is still contingent, even though I think it's like there's a reliable pro-sociality attractor from like a fact of the world that cooperation tends to pay off more than unchecked competition. You still can get divergence. And so if there is this necessary entailment between the realization of non-duality and then other including care, then that potentially is a stronger path to an even more super alignment. I guess I guess sometimes though I've been I mean, I've definitely I've had like some hallucinogenic experiences, for instance, where like this experience of not seeing myself or experiencing myself as different from others, leading to a kind of care. But I've also wondered whether there could be potential. How do I say this? You still could get something that is not differentiated, but not necessarily caring. I guess I'm thinking, I don't want to, this is probably not the best example, but I guess I'm thinking of like samurai, or like there's certain like within Buddhism, like for instance, you can get like the realization of emptiness sometimes can give rise to like a fierce warrior caste, which is capable of like the most extreme kind of sociopathy. And so I guess I'm wondering about like I see why there would be this like logical necessity between non-duality and other including care, but at least it seems to be there are some cases where you can have a profound realization of emptiness, but still not necessarily produce something like a bodhisattva. Maybe something that's like almost the opposite.
Yeah. I think that's a really valuable point. And in fact, in at least in the Tibetan tradition, they say that compassion and emptiness are like two wings of a bird that cannot fly without having both. And many teachers say that too much emptiness can indeed lead to a kind of detachment and coldness towards the suffering of others. So I like maybe the kind of promising path is something like a dual approach. You need the recognition of interdependence and the quality of non-duality, but you also need maybe the top-down prior of care and compassion, the kind of bodhisattva intention. And so maybe it's really at the combination of these that the bird, or in this case the machine, acts gracefully in the world. The cool thing with AI that I will say is that we can test it, right? And in our case, in most cases, the kind of top-down directive of boundless care or compassion did tend to perform a bit better than emptiness alone. But it was cool that emptiness worked as well, and that actually their combination worked the best. And my hunch is that that's probably the direction. Probably the kind of deeper thing here is, how do you build an AI system from scratch in such a way that it can't help but be non-dual and caring? Because in some way we evolved in a particular way where the incentives for our survival sometimes went in a different direction, let's say, than cooperation. Sometimes it was it at least seemed to us in our best interest to go to war with the neighboring tribe, right? And this happened for millions of years, and so we have this competitive tendency, and competition isn't all bad either. but we have an opportunity to build this thing from scratch. So the other way about this is actually to take these insights and think about what would it look like for an AI system to simply not be able to represent itself as a kind of rigid object that then goes into adversarial bouts with its surroundings. What would that look like? If we can, for example, just as a silly example, but it's kind of promising, what you can do in AI systems is kind of tune the temperature on beliefs or priors. So essentially, like basically tune the size of the distribution of its beliefs. And so if you have a really peaky distribution in beliefs, what you're going to get is overconfidence in whatever it believes. And then you're getting less of this kind of openness to the present moment data, and less of a kind of willingness to revise beliefs, goals, etc., in light of, let's say, the suffering that the AI or the machine is encountering. So instead, if you were able to encode the system such that, well, your beliefs just cannot be that confident. It's just not in your parameters to have overconfident beliefs, or you have a sufficiently kind of Bayesian system where all beliefs and posteriors are deeply kind of in touch with the bottom-up prediction errors or the likelihoods and so on. And so then you get a system that's much more likely to remain in a kind of constant kind of dance with the present moment. I think one of the basic things we need to be careful with AI is stickiness. All of the basic fears we have come from an AI getting stuck on some sort of utility function that is not aligned with our well-being. But if the system is not getting stuck and is instead very much listening to the present moment, again, this is a lesson for all of us in some way, then it's much more likely to be aligned to that moment and respond to the needs of that moment appropriately. So I think finding these kinds of generalizable axioms that we can move around, that again, we kind of learned from contemplative practice and apply just as much to humans. Stickiness is just as much a kind of danger for us as it is for AI. Then I think there's some hope.
So on that point about stickiness versus changing with change, as it were, do you see any like dead ends for the LLM architecture versus other architectures, as some people have spoken to recently?
I mean, I'm hesitant to put a ceiling on scaling, because we don't know when the next kind of nonlinear jump will be. We saw a few of these happen, and yes, we seem to be getting some tapering off, but we might suddenly get a jump as soon as the kind of algorithm changes a little bit, or some other kind of surprising moment of insight in the latent space of the AI system. But I think basically like the kind of general flexible intelligence that keeps you responsive to the present moment in a continuous way, I don't see that being embodied well in the LLM architectures. I mean, these are basically always transient, very rarely kind of continuous systems. And certainly they're not embodied in a way where they're having a continuous sensory stream where they're able to build a functional world model. Usually you find more reinforcement learning architectures in embodied systems, and then maybe you tack on an LLM and you start to make some progress there in having an embodied system that is continuously learning and so on. The big kind of limitation in these AI systems that we highlight in the Beautiful Loop paper is the capacity for, again, this epistemic depth. And this is the ability for a system to know what it knows, essentially. And this is central because it's our ability to know what we know, which allows us to pursue the gaps in our knowledge. This is just one example. I mean, there's so many examples, but basically, like, it's just as important to know what I know so that I can know what I don't know. And this not knowing the gaps in my world model inspire me to pursue the resolution of these gaps. And this gives rise to curiosity, or in other words, epistemic foraging out in the world, so that we can then improve our world model. Essentially, we become epistemically agentic. in the sense that our consciousness is that which allows us to interrogate, transform, and find the gaps in our world model so that we can improve it in a continuous way and then maintain ourselves. And this epistemic depth, which I also think is somehow central to consciousness itself, is very much not present there. And epistemic depth, again, then another component besides curiosity is the flexibility. We're able to restructure our own understanding. We're able to reflect on our own knowledge structures. This is not the case at all with transformers. They're able to reflect on their own output, like if you do like chain of thought and so on, but there's no kind of separate's not the right word, but there's no higher order kind of modeling of its own epistemic states or its own beliefs or its own kind of posteriors of representation, as we kind of put it in the paper. And so there's some way in which a system not only has to model the present moment, but it has to model and predict its own model of the present moment. You see what I mean? And this gives rise to epistemic agency, knowing what we know, and in some sense, self-awareness itself. And so I think this is really foundational to what's missing in current systems.
Alon, you got a question?
Well, first of all, yeah, I things may not themselves be modelable with the same kind of architecture. Could just be a secondary LLM, say, that then is monitoring and even has access to even the model, an LLM that could have access to the other LLM's model and could be doing something in parallel. So you could have in other words, you could have the same architecture, but maybe not duplicated or multi-threaded, I guess, is one way to think about it, which certainly these models currently in their current incarnation do not, primarily because of computational costs, right? It's just ask OpenAI how much money they have to raise, right? It's an inference it's actually turning out to be a massive expense, and they can't be running, if we think there's multiple agents running around inside our heads, which we probably do have, then that's what it might take. And right now, the current state of affairs is such that you basically can run one autoregressive stream and that's it. But on the flip side, I'm curious, how the way you think about this thing, especially given the conversation around sort of Buddhist practice, which I'm certainly very naive about, but the concept of suffering as being, I think, very truly fundamental to compassion. Do LLMs suffer? And kind of purely a linguistic model, which is all that they are. They do not have any sort of sensory processing. Certainly don't have any way of modeling or of an internal state outside of, they try to, they're optimizing some objective function, but they're not really in any sense getting any sort of positive or negative feedback, even reinforcement learning. Let's not pretend that they're disappointed when they get the wrong response. It's nothing like that. We have all these physiological mechanisms that give us things like pain and pleasure and desire, and all of these things that are clearly embodied. And there's I don't think it's reasonable to propose that language, is in any way capturing that embodied sense of actual physiologically based suffering, say. And so could there be speaking the words of compassion, which they do very well, right? The LLMs they sound very compassionate. Their system prompts and their reinforcement learning has made them the language they're linguistically compassionate, you could say. And another way to say this, they're modeling the language of a system that would have compassion. But is it possible to have compassion, to care? Right? Can they care? And I've written a bit about this, right? Can you care about anything if you can't feel anything? Isn't caring sort of inherently, doesn't necessitate subjective experience, right? That's almost what caring is. Like the outcomes just can't possibly matter unless there's some pain or pleasure on the other end of it. And so you're talking about LLM dead ends. The LLMs may not have a dead end in terms of their ability to potentially linguistically simulate what linguistic caring is, But then the question is that sufficient? And I think it's a really important, very, very important question, because as much as they sound eager and to help, there's something deeper about what it means to be a caring human and caring about yourself, caring about others, that simply can't be there in their current incarnation. The language can't do that. So I guess that I was wondering to what extent, you thought about sort of the sensory-based foundation of compassion, and whether purely language models are really the appropriate way to go about it, except just to simulate it, to simulate the linguistic behavior associated with it.
Yeah, it's a deep point, and I really I feel that you're right that true care and compassion, the way that we think about it, is intimately tied to conscious experience. It's through our own conscious experience of suffering that we can, in a way, experience the suffering of others. Because actually, empathizing is in a way to actually suffer ourselves in some way, right? We are in some way in oneness with that person, and we know this from hyperscanning as well, right? Like the neural activity actually starts to predict and cohere with the neural activity of the other person, and consciousness is super fundamental there. And so I think it is a scary thought that LLM could, in theory, be simulating all the behaviors that look like care, but behind the scenes have this kind of alien idea of care that is completely actually misaligned in some way. It's plausible that is the case. And also in our contemplative AI paper, we discuss the importance of consciousness, that it may be that the solution to alignment is the same as consciousness. In fact, I get my big kind of picture claim would be that consciousness, mindfulness, alignment, and AGI are all the same problem. They're all the same thing. That's my experience as I kind of zoom in on these topics. They just kind of converge into very, very similar principles, and epistemic depth and hypermodeling is, one attempt at trying to get at this generalizable principle, this capacity to truly be aware. And as you said, okay, you can take a transformer model and tack on another transformer that's trying to, predict its output or even its parameters. And it's just not quite the same, right? Because what's unique about the human brain and body and world is that they're so deeply interwoven and interconnected, and they're dynamical. So the kind of computation, if we can even call it that the human brain is doing, is far more kind of dynamic, porous, thermodynamic, maybe even quantum, than what we're experiencing or seeing in LLMs. And our hypermodel, the part of us that's able to reflexively know what we know, is something that is like deeply interwoven with the content of experience itself. It's completely woven into it, and the feedback loop between these two things are so integrated that you can't even say that they're separate modules at all. In fact, that's the weird thing about brains, is that the substrate is simultaneously kind of doing the computation while actually kind of just being the substrate. And this is not something that computers do. And it's completely malleable, like our substrate. I mean, what the heck even is a substrate? The whole conversation about substrate is weird, because substrate's empty in some way, because where do you draw the line? Where are you zooming in and saying this is the substrate? That just doesn't exist very clearly with humans at all. We are completely porous creatures and genuinely interdependent with the world. And in some ways, with these systems that are kind of locked in to various kinds of layers of boxes, we are removing this layer of interdependence, and so we have to kind of nudge them to intellectually realize this in a way that's different to us. And all of this is very much bounded in with suffering and care. I agree.
Let's see. Anyway, Damaris, you got a question?
Yeah, a little on the how we know what we know. I must say I'm a little confused on the term knowing, the way you use it. And because it is very intimately connected with the recursion of the hypomodel, if I understood your paper correctly. But so I'm not quite sure, do we know knowing kind of like in this like epistemic, like we can consciously list, you know, facts or something type of knowing, or is it more like an embodied, fuzzy, like, oh, there's something there type of knowing? Is it both? And then if it is both, why is it all like the same mechanism? Like, yeah, if you could go into that and maybe also a little bit the computational model behind it, I'd love that.
Yeah. I think the recursion is in our model at least is right down the stack necessary for conscious experience. So there are many people who have modeled consciousness as some sort of metacognitive type thing, and I think that's basically entirely wrong, because we can be aware or not of metacognitive processes, higher order thought, and so on, but I don't think that's necessary for consciousness, just like we can then be aware or not of deeply embodied interoceptive and sensory experiences. So the full stack of human experience, from like low abstraction to high abstraction, is all possible to be or not be conscious. And so you need a mechanism that's other than the abstraction process itself, or it needs to be parallel or orthogonal to abstraction. This is something that came up in our sort of original, if some of you might know, the many to none meditation paper, where you kind of traverse this abstraction hierarchy in the brain, and you have all sorts of interesting experiences that come out of that. This is also relevant, of course, in the psychedelic literature, rebus models, and so on. But they're not fully satisfying, for the reason being that still you don't know what is it that allows us to be aware of the abstraction hierarchy and traverse this abstraction hierarchy, from letting go of thoughts to coming closer to our experience, paying attention to the breath, and even having these kind of pure awareness experiences. There's some capacity that allows for that, and we call this epistemic depth, right? This is the part that allows us this recursive capacity to know what we know. And we put it on recursion because we think the immanence is so important, that it's not some meta layer. We instead think it's the content being shared with itself. So you're going through this process of building a model of reality that undergoes a selection process. So we call this inferential competition to enter the world model. So you get this coherent world model. Clearly, we're not conscious of the parts of processing that aren't in this coherent world model. Like the early stages of visual and auditory processing, we just don't have access to. We see objects as unified objects. We don't see them as lines and edges that are being kind of encoded at V1, right? And we don't see vision and auditory or interoceptive information really as kind of separated. In some drug experiences it can happen, but usually it's a kind of unified experience. So you have this selection process happening, enters this world model, but then this world model is shared with the system itself. But this world model includes our sensory experience. It includes the full embodied experience and all the way up to metacognition. But it's just a question of which part is kind of highlighted in the world model. The recursion here happens because the world model, because the brain is a system that can is highly integrated. It's both. It's kind of in this fine balance of segregation and integration. And so it builds this world model, and then it can share it with itself. Just in the same way that when I'm speaking, if I tune in, usually I'm kind of modulating this away, but if I tune in, I can hear my own voice. So my model is both creating the output of the voice, and it's also hearing the voice in this recursive way. Now, if you just imagine that happening in the brain with itself, it's building a world model, then it's sharing that world model with itself. So now the world model contains the knowledge of the world model. So the world model is constantly inferring the existence of itself because it knows that it has a world model. And then it's able to interrogate aspects of this world model through, again, I think, recursion. And it's far from being perfect, but I think it's the most satisfying to experience, and it is something that we know is deeply present within the way that the brain works, in the sense that we know that we're building a complex world model through layers of abstraction, and we know that there's exceptionally deep kind of feedback connections throughout the brain. So there's some way, and that we have these integration hubs that allows for this coherent experience to happen. So I think it's kind of going some of the way there. Now I'll talk a little bit about the modeling. This can get really into the weeds very quickly, but just give some intuition about what's going on there. So if you're actually trying to understand how a system is making a world model, what's happening, we propose, and in the active inference system is you've got a kind of precision competition happening, precision weighting competition. So precision weighting is essentially intuitively, it's kind of equivalent to confidence, or in neural terms, it's the gain on the representation. So how loud that representation is, let's say, and how confident it is, and how much we're giving it attention. It's kind of all of these kind of wrapped into one. And basically, the representations that have higher precision dominate the world model. So the precision kind of is if you want to put it in kind of phenomenological terms, the kind of clarity, the richness, the confidence we have in a representation in our world model. So if I'm paying attention to my hand, and I'm like really zooming into the little hairs on my hand, those little hairs have very high precision, and my computational resources are kind of devoted to the precision with which I'm representing that hair, right? Now my world model becomes essentially that hair. So the precision is kind of the distribution that kind of defines the clarity of that representation. So then the question is, how do you get this kind of recursive knowing of what we know? Well, then we just build a model of precisions themselves. That's what we propose. So the hypermodel is basically modeling precision. So the precisions reflect in a way what we're modeling about the outside world, our sensory data. These become, in a way, our attentional sets. And then what happens is the hypermodel is modeling those precisions, or it's modeling our attentional sets. So we're always aware of what we are, what is currently in our attentional frame, and attention is precision. So then what you need to do is just have a rich, deep, and temporally extended model of our attentional states, and then you basically get a system that knows what it knows, in the sense that it is having a higher order representation of the things that it's confident about, the beliefs that it's confident about. So that's the basic idea with the modeling.
Yeah, so is it, I mean, I don't read it as a higher order model in like the hot version, but it is in a way a higher order model. And you're saying that the phenomenological signature of this model is running optimal is knowing.
Yeah, that's what we're saying. And the problem is always when you are translating something, again, that's happening in the kind of warm, wet, dynamical, multi-scale system into something that's kind of modular and well-defined, you end up doing something that looks much more higher order than what we are actually proposing in terms of what we think is going on in the brain. And we try to also make this clear as we go into the modeling. Like we got to remember that it's the way that nature has achieved this is somewhat different. It's much more entangled. The information is all kind of spread out. I think this is also something cool about IIT, is that they kind of recognize the way that information is like so deeply entangled everywhere in the brain. And so yes, it starts to look a little bit more higher order and so on in the actual formal setup, and you know, we might run into things eventually where when you put it in this kind of higher order frame, you get something that looks like it's doing all the things that a conscious system is doing, but you don't actually get the phenomenology come out. And maybe what's actually needed for that phenomenology is that deep entanglement with all of reality. I'm very open to that possibility.
All right, cool. If anybody else has any other questions, if not, I'm gonna hop in with some of my own. Adam?
Sure. So if I'm understanding epistemic depth, so as part of the loop, the unified reality model can whose evolving state could be understood as an iterative contest for Bayesian model selection over what you think is happening in the world. And then you're generating a joint posterior, which is becoming like a prior and a hyper prior for the next moment of experience, influencing the bias competition in the next moment, which will then influence the new states, integrated state, which then in the next moment influencing the bias competition in terms of this intertemporal coherence from moment to moment. So I can see how some forms of self-reflection would come from this like strange loop or this like this recursion. I guess I'm wondering what forms of meta-modeling and self-modeling could we expect to come out of this and not come out of this in terms of like are some sorts of some forms of self-knowledge or meta-awareness as potentially involving things like different types of mental actions, the ability to like contextualize things into causal sequences. Like there's like a range of ways one can be meta-aware. So I guess what I'm wondering is what forms of meta-awareness are coming for free or are entailed in this beautiful loop with epistemic depth, and what's the scope of the range of meta-aware phenomena that we might be able to expect from this in terms of the forms of self-reflection from this recursive process? That was a pretty rambly. I don't know if it made any sense.
No, it was actually quite the opposite. In fact, I was smiling when you were describing because I was just so I don't think I've heard anybody like reflect back the theory so clearly, and I just like found that really satisfying. And especially this part, right? That the key thing, that one of the key kind of struggles for an organism is that we got to build this world model and then we got to maintain its coherence. And so part of what is happening with this loop is that you build the world model, but then this world model also constrains the what makes it into the world model in the next iteration over time. And this kind of keeps us rolling with this continuous world model. Then the cessation happens and boom, broken, and then it comes back. But anyway. So the question on what kinds of meta-awareness? Well, for me, I like what I was trying to, and what we were trying to explain is this kind of reflexive awareness, which is just this quality of knowing what we know, which is just the very basic kind of sense that features of the world model are kind of lit up with awareness in the sense that, I'm able to kind of reflect the quality of it in some way. In some way, I'm able to hold it in mind and able to have the sense that I know what I'm experiencing. So this kind of very fundamental reflexive knowing of anything in the world model is what I was hoping to explain. All the kind of features or different types of meta-awareness, I think these fall more in the space of various kinds of contents of mind, various kinds of metacognitions. And so they're all kind of variations in the abstract layers and the way that the kind of world model is constructing itself and the way that the world model is kind of emphasizing different parts of itself and so on. And the way that the kind of model of the agent is interacting with the world, and you get all sorts of weird kind of loops within loops. But the big beautiful loop, the big beautiful loop is the whole world model having this kind of reflexivity, of course, with some parts being brighter than others. So that's why we call this, we emphasize this kind of non-local quality to it, because a lot of the time consciousness gets wrapped up, and I don't think this is what you're doing at all, but gets wrapped up in our kind of experiences of ourself as an agent behind the eyes. But if we take seriously the kind of experiences that are possible, then we know that more fundamental experiences of consciousness or more minimal models of consciousness can be pure, can be agentless, can be selfless, can be this sort of non-local reflexivity. And I think this is a much more fundamental kind of layer of consciousness that actually needs explanation. All the kind of metacognitive qualities that get wrapped up in other theories of consciousness, I think, is a major limitation. And the limitation comes out of a lack of, frankly, contemplative or psychedelic experience. Like you need to be able to see that there are states of consciousness that are selfless to say, oh, the kind of consciousness that we're trying to explain is not one that's metacognitive. It's something that's deeply immanent and potentially kind of non-local, at least phenomenologically. And so this is why we emphasize the kind of global world model as this kind of shared coherent space within the brain. And again, I don't think that's exactly what you're pointing to, but
I mean,
maybe
not
there's-
exactly, but I think there is a, I think in some of the things I've expressed, they could be challenged along those lines, and it's a live question in my thinking of like what forms of selfing or minimal selfhood might be necessary conditions for being able to maintain coherence and to be able to generate um, uh, um, to allow the beautiful loop to keep unfolding. Like, is there still like, so through, advanced meditative states or some psychedelic states where, anything like an identifiable ego is like is dissolved and anything like a coherent selfhood, yet there still is experience that would seem to falsify the importance of this. But I guess I don't know if this is begging the question or moving the goalpost. But I still wonder sometimes, like, is there still just like a bare inner kernel of minimal egocentricity or self-representation that's, even though it's peeled back, is still there to a degree. The reason I've like wondered about this in terms of like a something like a self process and being necessary, I guess I'm thinking of the ways in which like to make sense of the way your modalities, their different information, their cross correlations in order to do like joint inference across them. Like one part of making sense of them is understanding like the ways that they all converge on your body with the nature of its sensors being like encephalized and concentrated. So like for instance, like alpha power, which you're showing like in your cessation events work, like the way it goes down, like so some of the sources of alpha come from like these like midline structures, particularly like around like the posterior cingulate, the precuneus, but around like those areas, and then when they're downregulated, this seems to correlate with experience of ego dissolution. But an interesting thing about these sources of alpha is there are also places where you get things like translation between egocentric and allocentric perspectival reference frames. They're part of the reasons like you're getting basically joint information across your modalities, but also things like information like from, I guess, the PAPE circuit, like the stretch receptor information of the neck, the vestibular apparatus, the yaw pitch roll of the head. So there's a way in which alpha and its sources, some of the information would have available to it, would be also the information that would be your egocentric perspective as a point of view on the world. And so I guess what I'm wondering is part of the way in which the reality model achieves a unified status and is able to pull off coherent Bayesian binding is because of its organization into something like an egocentric reference rate. Now, that's not necessarily talking about like a self that's meta-aware and self-reflexive, but still like some basic point of view, which can be peeled back. But then if you keep peeling it back, I've wondered whether the cessation event actually potentially even shows its necessity. Like if you strip back this egocentric coherence enough, eventually you get the phenomenology of coma. And so, so is it that the cessation event? So it's like so there's other experiences like before that where you're getting like nearly all like spatial temporal causal coherence selfhood seems to fall away, yet there's still experience that would seem to falsify the necessity of some kind of minimal egocentricity or minimal selfhood. But if you keep peeling it back, eventually the whole reality model or integrated unified reality model or integrated world model seems to collapse. So anyway, so yeah, so like, am I being like is it like a like so like I've wondered whether like you need something like almost like homunculi. Like you need something like self-representations of like the way your sensors are organized and situate you relative to the world as being part of the process of self-world modeling and generation of a stream of experience. Not something like what you're saying, not like waiting for something like a autonoetic consciousness or a reflective agent, but still some minimal self-like thing.
Yeah, it's great. I don't know if you guys have heard of the minimal phenomenal experience that Thomas Metzinger's been pursuing, and there's been various kind of research competitions to create computational models and the neuroscience of minimal phenomenal experiences. But it's all about basically coming up with a model of pure awareness, and a lot of those models kind of get at your question, Adam. But to say what I think, and I'm a little bit aligned, I think, with Thomas Metzinger's own model in Elephant and the Blind, in the sense that I think what is being reflexively known in these minimal states, the truly minimal states, is the epistemic space itself. So in the Beautiful Loop paper, we propose that it's essentially an empty world model. So the empty world model is just knowing itself. So you've basically quieted. There's like a sparse kind of precision field in the sense that you've kind of flattened the precisions to the point that you have no content in your posterior, but you are still generating this coherent world model, which is basically just then an empty epistemic space that is then being reflexively known. So computationally, it's as if the system is modeling the possibility for experience, but not experience itself. And so this is why you get basically just this sense of pure knowing or clarity itself, or the luminosity of just mind. It's basically just knowing without contents, you could say. And certainly I think from the phenomenological reports, and I've seen enough of these and experienced stuff close enough to this, that I'm persuaded that you can have this without any kind of self-referential or even first-person perspective, in the sense that it is genuinely non-local at the most minimal states, non-referential, or in classical Buddhism, they call this, I think it's reminiscent of the signless state, but it is still something other than cessation, because you still have this balloons epistemic space that is modeling itself. Now, as to like what the fundamental signal might be in the brain, Thomas Metzinger's proposal is that it's the arousal signal that's coming out of the reticular activating system. And so this arousal signal is basically just turning on the cortex. And so you're still having this arousal signal being represented, which is represented as just the epistemic space for contents, but then the contents don't actually happen. So this is one kind of promising way to start to think about it, but I think the jury is very much out, and there's a lot of people doing really interesting research on this. I think Edmundo Lopez Sola's work is great. I think Lars Sandved Smith's work on this is really great. Obviously, Thomas Metzinger and many others who are coming at this from unique angles. But most of us, what was also cool about this MPE competition was that many of us converged on some sense of the system modeling itself, and somehow that model being empty. I think there was a lot of convergence around this, and then the particular implementation was kind of different, but it was cool to see some sense of convergence there as well.
Demary. Yeah.
Thank you. Yeah, just a quick question to that. Actually, did you win the competition? I thought your paper was great, so I was wondering. But also, like, I read that in the very deep jhanas, like even 7 and 8, so where you like emptiness or complete infinity, that very experienced practitioners realize that there is still like a very tiny observer present. And so and which brings us, I think, to the whole question of like, how is the hypermodel related to self-modeling? Like, sure, like there is no concrete self and no concrete like self and object, so therefore non-dual. But somehow something seems still to be running that one can pick up as a very experienced practitioner. And maybe, I don't know if I'm just going to tag this onto this, like what can we learn from like multiple personality disorder on like self-modeling, and like how that might translate back to like these other questions.
Yeah, no, but that's exactly right. So especially in the Theravada Buddhist account, duality is kind of a subtle duality, which is connected to conceit or pride, is present all the way down the stack, even into the very late jhanas. And it's only actually in Nibbana, the liberation moment, that all of that is released. And so indeed, all the jhanas still have some duality. And so many experiences are, I suspect, especially on psychedelics, that seem unitive, that seem expansive, and seem non-dual, are not non-dual. And I kind of mentioned this kind of earlier. So very true that there's these subtle aspects of selfhood that kind of are hard to recognize even in very, 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 very deep states, and even potentially in some very, very subtle way at these minimal kind of states. What was the question about that? Remind me.
Oh, just like, so if we assume that kind of like the hypermodel running on empty gives us the phenomenological signature of emptiness and unity and awareness, possibility for knowing, etc. What does that tell us about the concept of self? Because like we've lost emotion, we've lost, a pain, any type of like body, like stuff, or like, even the body and outside world boundary, which a lot of people assume that's where the self comes from, right? You define like what's world, what's me, what, like, it doesn't quite seem to be true. If you still have like the absolute minimal signature of self available in these of like a hypermodel running on empty. So what does that tell us about how we build selves?
So it clearly reveals that in an absolute sense, the self model that we're running is not like permanently real, but it's relatively real. It's real in the way that we enact it to be true. It's real in the way that we are able to construct mental states that really affect the world. And it's real in the sense that people's beliefs about themselves affect their actions, affect their experience, and affect, therefore, niche construction and then politics and the cities and the countries and worlds that we build. So it's neither real nor not real, but in some sense we mistake it to be something much more fundamental than it actually is. And it totally makes sense that evolution selected for this relative egocentric model to be taken very seriously and for us to suffer if it's in any way threatened, real or imagined, because it's more likely that we will do what needs to be done to maintain that model and thereby survive, right? But clearly, I think what these contemplative practices and any other kind of approach to conscious experience from basically all the traditions in the world reveal is that that's not all as it seems. It's much more flimsy, and that we are we will suffer a lot less if we grip onto that self model or relax that grip to some extent. So I think in that sense, what these states reveal is that the nature of self is far more transient, constructed, and flimsy than we assume. And then if we do take that there's some part of us, this meta-aware, this reflexive kind of mindful part of us that is even deeper, that is, let's say, some sense free from this relative egotistical kind of rigid sense of self, then this reflexive awareness is in some way more stable, and you could even say more true and real in some sense, because it's more consistent. The self is always changing and whatever, but this kind of awareness is more stable and in that sense more consistent in its character, in the sense that it's just a kind of clear reflexive knowing of the present moment unfolding. But in many traditions, especially again in the Theravada school, it's said that even identification with this reflexive mindful knowing is a problem, in the sense that we can get stuck in this desire to always inhabit a space that doesn't have isn't egocentric, and this causes a new kind of suffering as one tries to destroy their ego and tries to always just be in this kind of reflexive awareness thing. This is a very common thing that happens in the path when you first discover the fact that there's this bigger part of what we are, this kind of capacity to simply know and to be present, and this deep presence that infuses our experience that is somehow beyond the mind, or what we take to be the mind. And so this is a small liberation, as in some way exceptionally satisfying and persuasive, and for that reason very prone to reification. In fact, I think it's unavoidable that at that moment that part of us becomes reified as who we are, and then we get into the kind of dualistic non-dualism where we try to maintain some sort of pure awareness all the time, right? This is another phase that has a different kind of suffering, because now we need to see the non-duality between our ordinary way of being and who we are, and this deeper part of us that we've discovered, and the path is endless, and so there's always more to learn and more to discover. So that's a few things that come to mind on that.
A quick comment. Yeah, I want to try to be clear that, like, when I'm thinking that some sort of minimal self process might be a necessary condition for experience, it would be more thinking of what Damaris was just mentioning, like as you move into later jhana states, like still like some basic like sense of perspective in self, but not necessarily like a reified, objectified self, and the and so it's. So if I'm understanding, you're taking like the phenomenology of non-dual states and minimal phenomenal experiences, and so you think so this would be the space of awareness without content, reflecting on itself, and potentially even, you mentioned like the reticular activating system. This would be like some of like really like Mark Solms types ideas of like the basis, like the precision waiter grounded and core homeostasis, generating these primary affects. That thing on its own, attending to itself, that potentially being what corresponds to the minimal phenomenal experience. Is that how you're understanding it, or?
I think that's the most plausible neurobiological model that I have in my head at this moment. Don't necessarily take that to be true, but it does capture some of the kind of strange phenomenology about it. The fact that in some sense it's got this kind of, it's often talked about as being kind of pure, clear light, completely contentless, and somehow this sense of like a base kind of the light being turned on by the arousal system, and that simply that kind of onness reflecting on itself feels like it resonates with the phenomenology, and is something that sort of makes sense. Because we do have this primal signal that's spread throughout the cortex through the reticular activating system that basically just turns things on. And so it has this quality of just energy itself reflecting on energy itself, right?
I find that to be a very plausible interpretation of it, and maybe it is the most plausible. I guess I've been maybe overly rigidly stuck to this idea, though, of I've pushed back on some of like Mark Solms' suggestions, like for instance that the core affective generator or these core affects at the level of like the brainstem are inherently conscious in their operations, and that like the idea, for instance, like of an unconscious feeling being an oxymoron, you might say. I've wondered whether, like, in order for I wouldn't want to call it like the power outlet of a TV. It's more than just that in terms of its the way it shapes consciousness, the reticular activating system. It's shaping it according to core homeostatic need and the modeling of the organism and its essential characteristics. But I wonder whether there is anything that it's like, whether like the brainstem has what it takes to be a sufficient quale generator, and whether you need some sort of representation and corticalization of it to be experienceable, to provide it with enough like spatiotemporal coherence that you could be aware of it. And so like so I guess what I've been wondering, like with these events, and you know them better because you're in touch with the phenomenology. I haven't experienced them, but like this sense of like luminosity and spaciousness, it could be, for instance, like these core precision weighting processes reflecting themselves, being aware of themselves, or whether that's just what happens, not just, but that's when you just start taking away contents and you start weakening coherence, and that basically a kind of diffuse sense of localizability, that you still might have like an inner kernel of a cortical, an thalamocortical locus, but I don't think
Yeah,
that.
I mean, I think like I share the hunch that probably there needs to be some sort of, again, I think it's a loop. Maybe it's a loop between the output of the reticular activating system and then the cortex kind of looping on itself. And so this is how you get it. I'm not exactly sure how to think about the substrate, though I would expect that some loop is online there. And as to the phenomenology, I think in terms of Mark Solm's story, because it's so linked to embodied feeling and homeostatic drives and affective states, I think the kind of purest versions of these minimal states are well beyond that. You really cannot say that they are embodied in any sense. In some way, it's so pure and so lacking in any content. That's the only thing you can say is that there is awareness itself and that there's clarity. So you really can't tie it so easily to any of the kind of embodied emotive or affective processes, at least if you take the phenomenology seriously. And that is the difficulty. And that's also, I think, why Thomas Metzinger has gone more towards this epistemic space question, is that it's almost like it's more like an abstract thing. It's the knowing itself kind of reflecting itself truly in a reflexive loop, as opposed to some other signal really driving. So anyway, I think bottom line is there's like endless amounts to learn here, and I do think the minimal model approach is kind of exciting, just because it gets us to thinking about what really matters with consciousness, as opposed to all of the misunderstanding in theories of consciousness that comes from a lack of phenomenological expertise. And then you get all of these things that are kind of conflating metacognition and self-processing and so on with consciousness, when clearly there's something much more, I think, fundamental going on.
Awesome. All right, I think we should wrap up. It's getting late for Ruben. Don't want to keep him too long. I think there's many things for a part 2 potentially with Andreas from QRI and Michael Levin. Maybe we'll get Friston on board one of these days. But Ruben and Adam, where can everybody find you online if they want to continue following the work that you're putting out?
For me, you can just go to rubenlaukkonen.com. I also have an X account and Substack, and you can find links to both of those on my website. Yeah.
Adam?
I guess my Google Scholar page, and yeah, I go through periods of activity and quiescence on X, and sometimes use Facebook as a kind of science blog. So just those are some places you could find me, and would love to keep the conversation going with whoever wants to keep exploring.
Perfect.
We
I mean,
should totally get you on Substack, Adam. You'd be you'd have
yes.
so much fun things to say there. Yeah.
Yeah, everyone's on Substack, Adam. You got to join the club.
Okay.
But I had many other things I also want to get into about the biological prompt engineering, placebo, hypnosis stuff. We can do that at another time. But if you could leave us, both of you, if you could leave us with some questions to think about, like a cliffhanger, what would you leave us with? It could be anything, at least somewhat related to all the stuff.
No, Adam, you go first. I need time to think.
Cliffhanger? Well, so I guess you mentioned earlier, like basically things like Feynman's quote of, what I cannot build, I cannot understand, and like if we're in possession of a sufficiently rich understanding of the sources of experience, how close, and if they have these functional properties that you're suggesting, and I agree with the relation to general intelligence and even alignability, how close are we to being able to reverse engineer and implement by other means? And years, decades, and to the degree, and what would it take to get closer on what timescales? Like what kinds of resources, what kind of research program would we need to be able to have a sufficiently precise understanding of the kinds of principles we're both exploring to actually implement them?
I love that. I love that. And what I would then prompted by this suggest is just this fact that we are in a very strange moment when we're actually beginning to build minds. And this requires us to reconsider everything that we've thought about, not only about how we work, but also like what brings us meaning and what we can achieve through contemplative practice. What is the meaning of contemplative practice? Where is it going? And can we refine these and build them into AI systems? And my feeling is that we need to have a completely new narrative about who and what we are in this moment, because the rubber hits the road in the fact that we can't anymore just kind of philosophically riff about the nature of mind when people are building them. There's a ground truth there now. Like we have to butt up against the facts of artificial intelligence and what's appearing there, and any kind of theories of mind or consciousness that ignore those facts are now, in my view, largely irrelevant. And this applies also to spiritual traditions. So I'm really curious about how contemplative and spiritual traditions have to evolve to contend with the realities that are emerging as a consequence of minds being built.
All right, that is well said. I think this is a great way to end the episode and leave us on a potential cliffhanger for sequel.